Welcome to the 15th and final part of the Blender 2.8 Beginners Tutorial series. In this video we will take a closer look at the Cycles render engine, which is a physical based render, which basically means that we can create more photorealistic renders from our 3D scene. Here we will take a look at some of the most important settings. We will adjust our scene a bit so that, for example, the water drops work better with the Cycles render engine, and we will render out an image using this engine and use some denoising features to remove the noise from these images. As always, you can find the timestamps in the video description below, and if you want to follow along, you can sign up to our resource section free of charge and download all the blend files, textures and videos of this tutorial series and our handy Blender 2.8 shortcut PDF. I run Zach here for cgboost.com, and let's get started. So before we get started, just a quick note that in this video I use an alpha version of Blender 2.8.1 because I want to use a new feature, the denoising filter, which is not available in Blender 2.8.0. And when you watch this video and Blender 2.8.1 is not out yet, you can download the latest version under builder.blender.org/download. So before we go over to the Cycles render settings and everything, let's do a few adjustments. First of all, let's go to Edit, Preferences. Here click on System, and as you can see up here we have the Cycles render device. By default, none is enabled, but I want to use my graphics card to render the scene in Cycles because in my case and also in many other cases, it's faster than using my CPU. When you use an NVIDIA graphics card, enable CUDA, and if you use an AMD graphics card, enable OpenCL. So in my case, I'm using a GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, so I enable CUDA. And you could even render with GPU and CPU at the same time if you enable this one here as well. But since I also screen record the whole thing, I won't render with CPU and GPU at the same time, only with GPU. So let's close the window. And before we switch over to Cycles, I hit F12 because I want to have a reference render from the Eevee render engine, which we later on can compare with the Cycles render. And in order to do that, by default, when you render something, the current rendering will be overwritten. And in order to avoid this, we can temporarily store a render here in Blender. Up here, you can see this render was rendered in slot 1. If I now switch over to slot 2, you can see this is empty, and every time I do a new render, this will be stored in slot 2, so I can change between 1 and 2 and then compare both of them. Now let's hit Escape. Then let's switch over to the shading workspace. Let's split the 3D view. Up here in the corner, left click and hold and move this into the view here, into the 3D view. Now I have two 3D views. Here I press T and the home button, and middle mouse click and hold, move this to the side and enable the rendered viewport shading. And over here, let's enable the viewport overlays and the gizmos. So here we have the rendered view, and here we can adjust things. And we also need the shader editor because, as you will see in a second, we need to adjust one material in the Cycles render engine. Also, I make this 3D view for the preview rendering relatively small because Cycles needs a lot of performance, and this can slow down the overall Blender experience. So the smaller you make this window, the more smooth everything runs. So now let's go to the render settings over here. And up here we find the render engine. And now let's switch this to Cycles. Now this is calculating using CPU, and this is relatively slow. And that's why I changed the device over here to GPU compute. So it uses the graphics card instead of the CPU. So the first thing you notice is that when I move around here, it starts very noisy. And then when the camera is still, it gets less and less noisy over the time. So basically with each render step, this gets less and less noisy, and you can see we have 32 samples enabled. That means basically 32 render steps. And since Cycles is a physical based render, in simple words, it works similar as in the real world because basically from all the light sources, light rays bouncing around in the scene and carry light around. And because of that, the light shadow reflection calculation is super realistic out of the box. That means we don't have to mess around with complicated technical shadow settings and everything. So in general, Cycles is much simpler to set up than Eevee. You can see over here the settings of Cycles are quite different than the ones from Eevee. We can still see something like film and the transparent option, for example. but overall we have less settings, and there are a bit more advanced settings like here in the light path, which we won't cover here. But in the end, if you just want to make some simple adjustments, all you need to change are the samples. So basically the render steps. The higher you set the render steps, the less noisy the image gets. However, if you basically want to have a noise-free image, you need to use thousands of samples, but since then the rendering process could take forever, we use a denoiser later on to remove the remaining noise in the image. Here you can see we also have viewport samples for the viewport display. You can see 32. And we also have the samples for the final renderer. So if you want to have a higher quality in the final rendering, we can adjust these samples here. If the viewport is too slow, there's a simple trick you can do. Let's go down to performance, and down here under viewport, change the pixel size, for example, to 2. Then the quality will be reduced quite a lot, as you can see, but then the viewport preview is much faster. But here I want to have full quality, so I set this back to automatic. But other than changing the device and adjusting the samples, you don't need to do much. The output settings are exactly the same as for the Eevee render engine. You can see we also use the 200% right now, so we have a higher resolution. So before we do a test render, we need to adjust a few things. So first of all, there's one difference with the lighting. If I select one lamp, go down to the lamp settings, you can see we don't have the custom distance, and that has an effect on the distance, how far the light travels basically, and then we can see the end of the wood here, which I don't like. So what we do, let's select the wood, tap into edit mode, press S for scaling, X twice for locking this along the local x-axis. Let's simply scale this very long. And since we used this seamless texture here with the box projection on the texture and the object output from the texture coordinates, the texture won't get stretched, which is pretty cool. It's basically just covering the whole ground here. But we can also still see the end over here. And because of that, we also change the array modifier count. So let's go to the modifier array and increase the count to maybe 30. So now the wood should cover a large area in the background, and then there should be a transition to completely pitch black. So and the second small issue we have here are the water drops. As you can see, they appear quite black. So the shadow in here is quite dark. So let's quickly adjust this. For that, let's select one drop object. And now we basically want to make the shadow more transparent. We can do that by simply adding a shader, mix shader over here. Then with Shift A shader, let's add the transparent shader. And now with this transparent shader, we basically want to make the shadow more transparent. Right now with this FX slider, we basically just make the whole thing more transparent. That means we also lose the intensity of the reflections. And I don't want to have this. I just want to make the shadow more transparent. And for that, I hit Shift A, go to input and add the light path node and connect the is shadow ray to the mix factor over here. And now you can see we have the water drops here with the full reflection, but the shadow completely disappears. So with this node, we basically restricted the transparency only to the shadow. And the cool thing is, if you still want to have a little bit of shadow, we simply have to lower the brightness of the transparent color. So if I lower this, you can see we will get some shadow back. So let's add a little bit of shadow to make it look a little bit more realistic, but not too much. And now we have relatively realistic water drops here in Cycles. And the cool thing is, if I now switch back to Eevee, this still works also with these settings here. So, and in general, just to mention this here once again, basically everything you create in Eevee or in Cycles will also work in the other engine. There are just some very small corner cases where this doesn't work, as you have seen here for the water drops, and some slight differences like here in the lights without the custom distance values. But overall, the two render engines are synced with each other, so you don't have to adjust everything, which is pretty cool. Now let's go to the render settings, and for now, let's reduce the samples to 32. I just want to show you the rendering with a very bad quality. So let's hit F12 or go up here to render image. And now, as you can see, the image will be rendered with these little tiles. And as you can see, also compared to Eevee, this takes much, much longer. And imagine we just have 32 render samples here, which is relatively low. And if you would render this with 1000 render samples, as you can imagine, this would take even longer. So cycles will take much longer in the rendering process, but the end result will be much more realistic. So you can remember the Eevee rendering took roughly 12 seconds or 13 seconds, and this took 52 seconds, but the image is still very noisy. What we are missing here is the bloom effect. This is not available in cycles. However, this could be achieved in post-processing, either in the compositor of Blender or later on by adding this in Photoshop, for example. But this is not part of this tutorial here. Let's quickly compare this with the Eevee render. If I switch back to slot number 1, you can see how this looks. And to switch between the slots quickly, you can also press the J key. And here you can see the difference. We have quite some difference in light and shadows, but overall I think the cycles render also looks better. So now is the question, how can we get rid of the noise? First of all, let's switch over to slot number 3 to also can compare it, and click on this button to get back. Down here, you can see the image editor is still enabled. Press Escape to also get back to the shader editor. Now Blender comes with 2 denoisers in the version Blender 2.8.1. So here I'm using an alpha version of Blender 2.8.1, which you can download under builder.blender.org/download, because this has a new denoising feature. First of all, I show you the old one, which is also in the stable version of Blender 2.8. To enable this, you have to go to the View Layers and simply down here enable denoising. You don't have to change anything here with the settings, and all you need to do right now is to render the scene again by pressing F12. Down here, let's hit Ctrl Space for the full screen. So now it's rendering with 32 samples, and if I zoom in here a bit, you can see that some of those small tiles are denoised already and others will be denoised a little bit later. And in this way, the noise will be removed. So this is an image rendered with 32 samples and the default denoiser enabled. As you can see, overall this works quite well. However, if we zoom in, you can see that in some places we have some artifacts, and overall the problem of denoisers is that you lose details. So also over here you can see we have some weird artifacts in some areas, which doesn't look so nice. The thing is, when you use this denoiser, you still have to use quite a high amount of render samples and then use this denoiser to just remove the little bit of noise which is still left. But it's still a decent result if I compare it with the noisy render without any denoiser. However, in Blender 2.8.1 we have a better option. And for that, let's also use a new slot so we can compare it with other stuff. Let's hit Escape to go back and hit Ctrl Space to also undo the full screen. In order to make the other denoiser work, we also go to the View Layers, disable this denoising here because we don't want to use this. Then let's go to Passes and enable denoising data. So passes and denoising data are basically additional render data Blender will create while rendering the image, and then later on in the compositor we can access this data and do something with that, and what this means you will see in a second. So whenever you change something here, enable or disable something, you have to re-render the image, so this new information will be created as well. So what I do, I press F12. So the rendering is done, as you can see, and in order to make use of the other denoiser, we have to switch over to the compositing workspace. Here we have to enable use nodes. Up here we are using the compositor, as you can see, which is a node-based tool to adjust your renders after the rendering process. It's a little bit like an image editor, since you can adjust your render. Just a quick example here. By the way, in order to see what's going on here, simply hold down Ctrl Shift and left click on this render layer node. Then this viewer node will be created, which basically shows the image in the background. Let's press N to hide the sidebar here. And in order to zoom the background in and out, you press V to zoom out or Alt V to zoom in. So let's zoom out a bit. And as you can see, the render layers node has all these different outputs here, and all these outputs are different passes. So everything we have set up here in the view layers passes will show up here as output from the render layers node. And if I hold down Ctrl Shift and left click, you can see that I'm cycling through these different passes. And you can see that these passes have different information, which we can use to adjust the rendering after the rendering process. So a very quick example on how you can adjust the rendering is if I hit Shift A, go to color and add a hue saturation value node. Then let's plug in the image and connect the image output to the composite node and to the viewer node. So the viewer node shows the result here in the background, and the composite node is important to output the final image in the end. So this hue saturation value node you already know from the shader editor, where we can adjust the materials. So here, for example, we can change the hue of the image. So we have the input from the rendered image, then we change the color, and this we output again to the viewer node and to the composite node. So in this way, we can easily adjust the rendering here in the compositor. And everything you set up here, as long as use nodes is enabled, and if you re-render your image, it will automatically apply all the things you have set up here in the compositor. So you also have some other stuff, for example, like filters. We have the blur filter, so we could blur the whole image if we like. So there's a lot of things you can do, but here I don't want to get any deeper into this compositor. Here I want to show you how to use the other denoiser. So first of all, let's hit Shift A, go to filter, and here you can see we have this denoise filter. Let's put it in here. And as you can see, we have some inputs, image, this purple one, normal, and the albedo. And all we need to do is to connect the noisy image with the image, the denoising normal with the normal, and the denoising albedo with the albedo. And then to better see the result, let's move the timeline up a bit and change this to the image editor. And in order to see the result of the compositor down here, click here and either use the render result. This will be basically the output we have in the composite node, or the viewer node. Let's use the viewer node in this case, which is the output of this viewer node here. So now let's zoom in a bit to see what's happening here. You can see this is quite noisy from our 32 samples render. And now if I connect the denoise image output with the viewer node and also with the composite node, you will see in a second after this is calculated how this denoise will look like. So you can see the noise is gone. And let's check down here. So once again, this here was the noisy image, and this is the result with the denoiser. So I think this does a quite good job, but now let's compare it with the other denoiser to see if this actually works better than this denoiser down here. So let's down here hit Control Space to go to full screen. Maybe let's keep zoomed in here so we can see the details. And in order to be able to switch to the other render results, we have to switch up here to the render result. So then you can see we have the slots again here, but now you can see that the denoising isn't working. So sometimes when the render result here from the composite node is not updating, what you simply can do is move this out from the composite node and put it in again. And as you can see, then this will be recalculated, and then we should see the denoised result in a second. Now let's hit Control Space again. So now let's go up here to the slots and go to slot number 3, which was the other denoiser. And as you clearly can see, especially on the water drops, we lose a lot of details with the first denoiser. Also, we had some artifacts down here, and especially up here. Let's switch over to slot number 4. Here you can see these artifacts are gone, which is great. And the water drops and stuff like this looks way better in my opinion. So, and we even have a little bit more details in the apple. So all in all, we are using very low samples right now. So in the end, I won't recommend to make a final high quality render with just 32 samples. So now I want to make a final rendering with a high quality. So we increase the render samples. Let's hit Control Space, go to the render settings, and let's increase the render samples to 256. And let's switch over to slot number 5. So now I do again a render with this higher quality and this denoiser up here. And then let's see how this result looks compared to the other renders. So let's hit F12. So the rendering is done, as you can see, and let's zoom in here to see some of the details. So this is already the denoised version, but let's check the noisy version first. So let's connect the noisy image with the composite node. So, and as you can see, all in all, this image already looks quite good. We have some noise here in the darker areas, which we can see clearly, I think where the reflection of the apple is stronger. And we have a lot of noise in these water drops here. So now let's reconnect the denoise with the composite node and see if this improves. So as you can see, this improves a lot in many areas. Here in some areas you can see we still have a bit of noise. So I guess in the end we still need to render this with even more samples if we want to have a higher quality. So now let's quickly compare it with the previous render of 32 render samples and the compositor denoiser. Let's go to slot number 4. And you can see definitely in the render with 256 samples, we have much more details. So if you now would increase the render samples to 1024 or something like that and re-render this will certainly take much longer to render, but you will probably have also much better quality. But yeah, if you just view it from afar and don't look into these details too much, then this looks fantastic already. So I think this denoising filter over here is fantastic to remove the final noise from your image. But as mentioned, I still would use a higher samples count to increase the quality of the image. So now I want to save this image. So down here, let's hit Control Space to make this full screen. As mentioned, we are here in the image editor. And now in order to save this, click on Image, Save As. So as you can see in Blender 2.81, the file browser looks a bit different, but all in all, it's just a rearrangement of all the tools. You still find everything as before. So let's go to the rendered folder. Let's select the apple scene. This was the Eevee render, and this I want to save as apple scene 02. So what you can do, you can either press the plus button on the numpad, or here with a plus and minus you can increase or decrease the number. Then over here we can change the file format. I want to have RGB with 16-bit and then simply hit Save as Image. So now you can open this on your hard drive. This is the Cycles render, as you can see, and this one is the Eevee render. The Eevee render is much darker, as you can see, and also in general, I think the Cycles render looks much better. So now you can do whatever you like with this image, share it on social media, show it your friends, and do whatever you like. So here in Blender, let's go back to layout, and don't forget to save. Yeah guys, I hope you now have a good idea on how to use the Cycles render engine to create even more juicy renders from your 3D scenes. This was the final video for this series. I hope you enjoyed it and learned a lot. If you have any final result to share, you can share it with me on Twitter or Instagram. I would love to see your renders. Also, let me know in the comment section below what other topics you would like to see in the future on this YouTube channel here. And as always, if you liked this video, make sure to give it a like, subscribe to this channel and ring the bell underneath this video if you don't want to miss any of our future videos. So if you're now excited and want to learn more about Blender, you might enjoy our courses, which you can find at academy.cgboost.com. There you can find, for example, our Blender 2.8 Launchpad course, which is a comprehensive introduction into Blender 2.8 with roughly 200 easy-to-chew short videos and fun exercises. And there you will also learn how to create a fully animated scene from scratch. So there we will also cover topics which we don't cover in this tutorial series here. If you want to learn more and check the free preview videos, follow the link in the video description. Yeah guys, thanks so much for watching and following along. I will see you in one of my next videos. Goodbye.